He's not breathing. Help me!
I'm calling one. Is he choking? Lay him down. We need to check his pulse.
I'm trying!
The Kensington estate had never seen chaos like this. 18 of the world's most decorated physicians crowded into a nursery that cost more than most homes, their white coats a blur of frantic movement under crystal chandeliers. Heart monitors screamed. Ventilators hissed. A team from Johns Hopkins barked orders at specialists flown in from Geneva, while a Nobel laureate in pediatric immunology wiped sweat from his forehead and whispered what no one wanted to hear. We're losing him. Baby Julian Kensington, heir to a $40 billion empire, was dying, and $50,000 an hour in medical expertise couldn't tell anyone why. His tiny body had turned the color of twilight. Blue lips, blue fingertips, a strange, mottled rash creeping across his chest like accusation. Every test came back inconclusive. Every treatment failed. And through the servant's entrance window, pressing his face against glass that had never been cleaned for someone like him, stood Leo, 14 years old, son of the night shift housekeeper, wearing a coat 3 winters too thin and shoes held together with prayer. He'd spent his whole life being invisible on this estate, the boy who walked the edges, who noticed everything because no one ever noticed him. Right now, he was staring at the potted plant on the nursery windowsill, the one that had arrived 3 days ago, the one that had left an oily, yellowish residue on the gardener's gloves that had touched the baby's crib railing during yesterday's cleaning, the one that every genius in that room had walked past 17 times without a second glance. Leo's hands trembled. He knew what it was. His grandmother, who'd healed half of Kingston's poorest neighborhood with nothing but herbs and faith, had taught him to recognize that leaf pattern before he could read. Digitalis, devil's trumpet, angel killer. The doctors were about to cut that baby open looking for answers. The answer was sitting in a ceramic pot, wrapped in a bough. Leo looked at the window, then at the security guard making rounds, then at his mother's face through the kitchen door, the woman who'd warned him 1,000 times. Stay invisible. Stay safe. Don't give them a reason to throw us out. He thought about what would happen if he was wrong. Then he thought about what would happen if he was right, and did nothing. Leo pulled his coat tight, took a breath, and ran. What would you risk to save a life that the world says isn't your business to save? Leo had learned to walk without making a sound by the time he was 6 years old. It wasn't a skill anyone had taught him. It was survival. When you lived in the groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of a billionaire's estate, a cottage so small it could fit inside the Kensington family's walk-in closet, you learned quickly that your existence was tolerated, not welcomed. You learned to move like smoke, to breathe like a secret, to become so small, so quiet, so utterly forgettable that the wealthy people floating through their marble lives never had to be inconvenienced by the reminder that you were alive. His mother, Grace, had worked for the Kensington family for 11 years. She'd started when Leo was just 3, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees while pregnant women in designer gowns stepped over her like she was part of the furniture. She'd worked through 2 miscarriages, a bout of pneumonia that nearly killed her, and the slow death of every dream she'd ever had for herself. Also, Leo could have a roof over his head and food in his belly. "We are blessed," she would tell him every night, her voice soft with exhaustion and something that might have been faith or might have been denial. "Mr. Kensington lets us live here. He pays for your school books. We are blessed, Leo. Don't ever forget that." Leo never argued with her. But he also never forgot the way the Kensington children looked through him when they passed, like he was made of glass, or maybe just air. He never forgot the time Arthur Kensington III had fired a gardener for making eye contact with him during a business call. He never forgot the sign on the main house's service entrance. Staff must use rear access. Visible presence on main grounds prohibited during family hours. Blessed. Sure. If you're already hooked on Leo's story, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. The Kensington estate sprawled across 47 acres of manicured perfection in the hills above the city. There were gardens designed by celebrity landscapers, fountains imported from Italy, and a hedge maze that had been featured in 3 architectural magazines. There was a tennis court, a helicopter pad, and a swimming pool shaped like the family crest. There was a 12-car garage filled with vehicles that cost more than most people's houses, and a wine cellar that held bottles older than Leo's grandmother would have been if she'd lived. Leo knew every inch of it. Not because he was allowed to explore. God, no. He knew it because he'd spent his entire life watching from the margins. From the tiny window of the groundskeeper's cottage. From behind the rhododendron bushes when he was supposed to be walking to the bus stop. From the shadows of the service corridor when he snuck in to bring his mother her forgotten lunch. He'd mapped the estate in his mind the way other kids mapped video game levels. He knew which security cameras had blind spots. He knew which doors were left unlocked during the 3 p.m. shift change. He knew that the head of security, a thick-necked man named Briggs, took a 20-minute smoke break behind the pool house every afternoon at 4:15. He knew these things because knowing them made him feel like he had some kind of power in a world that constantly reminded him he had none. But lately, Leo had been watching for a different reason. 3 months ago, Eleanor Kensington had given birth to a baby boy, Julian Arthur Kensington IV. The heir, the prince, the future of a dynasty built on tech patents and pharmaceutical acquisitions and the kind of generational wealth that most people couldn't even conceptualize. The baby had arrived in a flurry of magazine covers and society announcements. A professional photographer had been hired to capture his first moments. A team of night nurses rotated in 8-hour shifts. A nutritionist had been flown in from Switzerland to consult on Mrs. Kensington's diet to ensure optimal breast milk composition. Leo had watched it all from his usual place, the shadows. And somewhere along the way, something had shifted in his chest. He'd started timing his walks to school, so he'd pass the nursery window at sunrise, when the nurse would hold Julian up to see the morning light. He'd started lingering near the kitchen entrance when he knew the baby would be taken for his afternoon stroll through the gardens. He'd started feeling something he couldn't quite name, a strange, aching tenderness for this tiny person who had everything Leo would never have, but who also seemed so small, so fragile, so utterly unaware of the weight of the crown he'd been born wearing. Maybe it was because Julian was innocent. Maybe it was because Leo remembered what his grandmother used to say. Every child comes into this world pure, baby. What happens after? That's on us. Or maybe it was because Leo understood, in some bone-deep way, that he and Julian were both prisoners of circumstances they hadn't chosen. Julian would spend his life in a golden cage, performing for cameras and shareholders, and a father who saw him as a legacy rather than a person. Leo would spend his life in the margins, invisible and uncounted, his potential measured only by how well he stayed out of the way. 2 boys, 2 prisons, same estate. This story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you can follow Leo's journey to the very end. Hit that subscribe button now, you won't regret it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Leo first saw the plant. He was walking back from school, taking his usual route along the service road that ran behind the mansion's east wing. The autumn air was sharp with the smell of dying leaves and approaching rain, and Leo had his coat pulled tight against the chill. The same coat he'd been wearing for 3 years now, the one with the fraying sleeves and the broken zipper that his mother kept promising to fix but never had time for. A delivery van was parked near the service entrance. This wasn't unusual. The Kensingtons received packages constantly, everything from rare wines to custom furniture to organic baby food flown in from organic farms in New Zealand. But something about this delivery made Leo slow his steps. The deliverman was carrying a plant. It was beautiful, Leo had to admit. About 2 feet tall, with dark green leaves that seemed to shimmer with an almost oily sheen. Pale, bell-shaped flowers hung in delicate clusters, white with purple streaks, like bruises on porcelain. The pot was wrapped in an elaborate gold bough, and a card was tucked among the stems. Old Mr. Harrison, the head gardener, met the deliverman at the door. Leo watched from behind the rhododendrons as Harrison signed for the package, his weathered hands reaching out to steady the pot. And then Leo saw it. When Harrison's fingers brushed against the leaves, they came away glistening with something. A residue. Yellowish and faintly sticky, like tree sap, but wrong somehow. Harrison noticed it too. Leo saw him frown down at his gloves, rubbing his fingers together with a puzzled expression. But then the deliverman said something, and Harrison laughed, and the moment passed. He carried the plant inside, presumably toward the nursery where all the baby gifts were displayed, and Leo was left standing in the shadows with a strange unease coiling in his stomach. He knew that plant. He couldn't remember from where, not exactly. But something about those leaves, those flowers, that oily residue. It tugged at a memory buried deep in his mind. His grandmother's voice, maybe, from those summers he'd spent with her in Jamaica before she passed. She'd taught him about plants the way other grandmothers taught their grandchildren about baking or knitting. She'd walked him through her garden, pointing out which leaves could heal and which could kill, which flowers were medicine and which were poison dressed in pretty colors. The devil's most beautiful work, she used to say, is always wrapped in something lovely. You have to learn to see past the beauty to the danger underneath. Leo stood there for a long moment, that unease growing heavier with every breath. He thought about going to find his mother. He thought about knocking on the service entrance and telling someone, anyone, that something about that plant felt wrong. But who would listen to him? He was nobody. The maid's son. The shadow boy. He didn't even exist in the Kensington's world except as a minor inconvenience to be managed. So Leo did what he always did. He swallowed his instincts, buried his unease, and walked back to the cottage to start his homework. 3 days later, he would realize that decision almost cost a baby his life. What Leo discovers next will change everything, not just for him, but for the entire Kensington family. Don't miss Chapter 2. Subscribe now and be the first to find out what happens when the unthinkable becomes the only option. The sirens came at sunset. Leo was sitting at the wobbly kitchen table, working through a geometry problem he didn't really care about when he heard them. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer, more urgent. He went to the window and watched as 3 ambulances came screaming up the private drive, followed by a convoy of black SUVs and 2 helicopters that descended onto the lawn like mechanical birds of prey. His mother burst through the cottage door minutes later, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Something's wrong with the baby," she gasped, already reaching for her work uniform. "Something's terribly wrong. They're calling in doctors from everywhere. I have to go help. I have to." She was gone before Leo could say a word. He stood at the window for hours that night, watching the mansion blaze with lights, watching figures in white coats rush back and forth past the nursery window, watching the shadows of chaos dance across the manicured lawns. And deep in his gut, beneath the fear and the confusion and the strange grief he felt for a baby he'd never even held, one thought kept surfacing like a body in dark water. The plant. The plant. The plant. Leo has seen something the doctors haven't. But will anyone listen to a poor boy from the margins? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single word. The Kensington mansion had transformed into a war zone. Leo had never seen anything like it. Through the nursery window, the same window he'd pressed his face against 1,000 times to catch glimpses of baby Julian sleeping peacefully in his hand-carved Italian crib, he could now see nothing but chaos. White coats everywhere. Machines he couldn't name blinking and beeping and screaming in electronic panic. Hands moving with frantic precision, injecting, adjusting, measuring, failing. Always failing. He'd crept closer than he should have. Much closer. The security teams were too distracted by the medical emergency to patrol their usual routes, and Leo had slipped through the hedge maze like a ghost, positioning himself behind the ornamental fountain where he had a clear sight line into the nursery's floor-to-ceiling windows. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Baby Julian, tiny, precious Julian who Leo had watched learn to smile at the morning light, was the color of a bruise. His small body lay in the center of a medical hurricane, surrounded by more equipment than Leo had ever seen in one place. Tubes snaked from his arms. Monitors tracked heartbeats that stuttered and stumbled like a drunk man walking home. And his skin, God, his skin was this terrible grayish blue, mottled with a rash that seemed to spread even as Leo watched. He looked like he was dying. He looked like he was already dead and just hadn't realized it yet. If this story is gripping your heart the way it gripped mine writing it, you need to subscribe right now. What happens next will stay with you forever. Don't miss it. The doctors had started arriving within an hour of the first ambulance. Leo had counted them as they came. Black cars and helicopters depositing an army of medical royalty onto the Kensington lawn. He'd heard his mother whispering their names to another maid in terrified reverence as she rushed past the cottage. Dr. Heinrich Voss from the Geneva Institute of Pediatric Medicine. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the Tokyo neurologist who'd saved the Japanese Prime Minister's grandson. Dr. Michael Sterling from Johns Hopkins, whose waiting list was 3 years long and whose fee was rumored to be $50,000 just for a consultation. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, the Nigerian-British immunologist who'd been nominated for a Nobel Prize. Dr. Samuel Chun, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, Dr. Alexander Petrov, Dr. Isabella Ruiz. 18 of them. 18 of the greatest medical minds on the planet. Each one carrying degrees from institutions Leo could never hope to attend. Each one armed with knowledge that had taken decades and millions of dollars to acquire. 18 experts. And not a single answer. Leo could see them through the window, arguing now. Dr. Voss was gesturing emphatically at a chart, while Dr. Sterling shook his head. Dr. Tanaka had stepped back from the group, her arms crossed, her expression troubled. A younger doctor, Leo didn't know his name, was running yet another blood test while a nurse changed yet another bag. They were lost. Leo could see it in their body language, in the way their confident postures had begun to crumble as the hours passed. These titans of medicine, these gods of the healing arts, were standing in a $40 million nursery with every resource on earth at their disposal, and they had no idea why a 3-month-old baby was dying in front of them. Arthur Kensington stood in the corner of the room, and Leo had never seen a man look so broken. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors and moved through the world like he owned it, which, in many ways, he did, was clutching his wife's hand with white-knuckled desperation. Eleanor Kensington hadn't stopped crying for hours. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect makeup destroyed, her society page composure shattered into a million pieces on the Italian marble floor. Their baby was dying, and all their money couldn't save him. This is the moment everything changes. But you'll only see it if you're subscribed. Hit that button now. Leo's about to do something that will shock everyone, including himself. Leo watched the doctors cycle through their theories. Bacterial infection. They pumped Julian full of antibiotics that did nothing. Viral inflammation. They tried antivirals that made no difference. Autoimmune response. They administered immunosuppressants that didn't suppress anything. Genetic disorder. They ran tests that came back inconclusive. Allergic reaction. They shot him with epinephrine that might as well have been water. Each theory emerged with confidence and collapsed in confusion. Each treatment was administered with precision and failed with cruelty. Leo watched it all through the window, his hands pressed against the cold stone of the fountain, his heart hammering against his ribs. Because he knew something they didn't. He knew about the plant. It was still there. He could see it from where he crouched. Sitting on the windowsill of the nursery, its pale bell-shaped flowers catching the harsh medical lights, its dark leaves shimmering with that oily sheen. The doctors walked past it constantly. They adjusted their equipment around it. They set their coffee cups and tablets and medical charts down next to it without a second glance. It was invisible to them, part of the background. Decoration. Just like Leo. He remembered his grandmother's lessons now, the memories surfacing with painful clarity. They'd been sitting on her porch in Kingston, the summer he was 9, and she'd been showing him pictures in an old book with a cracked leather spine. This one here, she'd said, pointing to an illustration of bell-shaped flowers that looked almost exactly like the ones in the nursery. We call it devil's trumpet. The fancy doctors call it digitalis. Beautiful, yes? But the oils on those leaves, just touching them can slow a man's heart right down. And if you're small, if you're a baby, she'd shaken her head slowly. Even breathing the air around it too long can poison the blood. Leo's grandmother had known things that no medical school taught. She'd learned her healing arts from her mother, who'd learned them from her mother, who'd learned them from ancestors who'd had nothing but the plants around them and the wisdom passed down through generations of survival. She'd delivered babies in homes with no electricity. She'd cured fevers with bark and leaves when there was no money for doctors. She'd saved lives with knowledge that the fancy physicians would have dismissed as superstition. And she'd taught Leo. Not everything. She died before she could finish, taken by a stroke when he was 11, leaving him with fragments of her wisdom rattling around in his head like seeds in a dried gourd. But she'd taught him enough. Enough to recognize the shape of those leaves. Enough to remember the warning about the oily residue. Enough to understand, with growing horror, what he was watching happen to baby Julian. The doctors were looking for something inside the baby. They were scanning his blood for invaders, probing his organs for defects, searching his DNA for errors. They were looking in the wrong place. The enemy wasn't inside Julian. It was sitting 3 feet away from his crib, wrapped in a gold bow, pretty as a picture and deadly as a viper. Leo knows the truth. But knowing isn't the same as acting, and what he's about to do will cost him everything. Subscribe now because Chapter 3 is where this story explodes. The hours crawled past like wounded animals. Leo stayed at his position behind the fountain, unable to leave, unable to look away. His legs cramped. His fingers went numb from the cold. His mother would be looking for him soon, frantic with worry, but he couldn't make himself move. He watched Dr. Sterling call a conference in the corner of the nursery, gathering the other 17 physicians into a cluster of expensive suits and grave expressions. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could read their body language. The head shakes, the spread hands, the defeat settling over them like ash. They were giving up. No, not giving up. Preparing. Leo saw one of the doctors motion toward the door, toward wherever the operating room had been set up. He saw another doctor begin prepping what looked like surgical equipment. They were going to cut that baby open. They were going to dig through his tiny body searching for an answer that wasn't there, and the surgery would stress his already failing system past the point of no return, and Julian would die on an operating table surrounded by 18 useless degrees. Leo's hands curled into fists. He thought about his mother, about what would happen to her if he did what he was thinking about doing. She'd lose her job, that was certain. They'd be thrown off the estate, probably prosecuted for trespassing, maybe worse. Everything she'd sacrificed for 11 years would be destroyed because her son couldn't keep his head down and stay invisible like he was supposed to. He thought about himself, about how easy it would be to just walk away, to go back to the cottage and pretend he hadn't seen anything, hadn't understood anything. He was nobody, the maid's kid. What happened to Billionaire's babies wasn't his problem and wasn't his business. He could keep his head down, finish school, maybe get a scholarship somewhere, make something of his life without taking this insane risk. He thought about his grandmother, about the way she'd looked at him when she taught him about plants, about healing, about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of people who'd had nothing but each other and the earth beneath their feet. This wisdom is your inheritance, she'd told him once. Not money, not land. This, what I'm putting in your head right now. Promise me you'll use it when it matters. He'd promised, and then he'd spent years being ashamed of that inheritance. Being embarrassed by the grandmother who'd never learned to read, who'd spoken with an accent that made people assume she was uneducated, who'd healed with herbs and prayers when real doctors used machines and drugs. He'd wanted to be modern, sophisticated, acceptable. He'd wanted to be anything other than the descendant of enslaved people who'd had to figure out their own medicine because no one else would help them. But right now, in this moment, that inheritance was the only thing that could save Julian's life. And Leo was the only one who carried it. What would you do? Would you risk everything, your home, your mother's job, your entire future, for a baby whose family has never even acknowledged your existence? Leo is about to make his choice. Make sure you're subscribed to see what happens next. Leo looked at the nursery window one more time. Julian's monitors were flatlining. The doctors were rushing now, shouting orders, preparing for emergency surgery that Leo knew in his bones would kill the baby faster than the poison already in his system. He thought about what his grandmother would do. And then Leo stood up from behind the fountain, stepped out of the shadows that had hidden him his entire life, and started running toward the mansion. He had no plan, no strategy. No idea how he was going to get past security, past the doctors, past Arthur Kensington himself. He only knew that he had to try, that if he walked away now and that baby died, he would carry the weight of it forever, that some things mattered more than staying safe, more than staying invisible, more than protecting a life that wasn't really living anyway. His feet pounded against the manicured grass. The cold air burned his lungs. Somewhere behind him, a security guard shouted in surprise. Leo didn't stop. He was done being a shadow. Leo is running toward the impossible, toward armed guards and angry doctors, and a billionaire who could destroy his life with a single phone call. What happens next will either make him a hero or a criminal, possibly both. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment everything changes. Leo hit the service entrance at full speed. The door was unlocked. Thank God for small mercies and distracted staff. And he burst through it into the chaos of the kitchen. Caterers who'd been hired for a dinner party that would never happen stood frozen at their stations, their faces pale with the reflected anxiety of the medical crisis happening upstairs. A sous chef dropped a copper pot with a clang that echoed through the marble halls. Someone screamed. Leo didn't stop. He knew this house. He'd memorized every corridor, every shortcut, every back stairway that the family never used but the staff traveled daily. His feet carried him through the kitchen, past the pantry, toward the narrow servant staircase that wound up to the second floor like a secret spine hidden inside the mansion's gilded body. Hey, stop right there. Briggs, the head of security. Leo heard the man's heavy footsteps thundering behind him, heard the crackle of a radio as Briggs called for backup. But Leo was smaller, faster, and desperate in a way that Briggs couldn't understand. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his worn shoes slipping on the polished wood, his hand gripping the railing so hard his knuckles screamed. Second floor. East wing. The nursery was at the end of the hall, past the family portraits and the antique vases and the silk wallpaper that cost more per square foot than his mother made in a month. 2 more guards appeared at the top of the stairs. Leo's heart seized. They were big, both of them, with shoulders like refrigerators and expressions that said they'd been waiting their whole careers for a chance to tackle someone. They spread out, blocking the hallway, arms extended like they were herding cattle. "Son, you need to stop right now," one of them said, his voice carrying that false calm that adults used when they were about to do something violent. "You're trespassing on private property. Whatever's going on, we can talk about it, but you need to." Leo feinted left. The guard bit. He lunged in that direction, his massive body committed to the movement, and Leo spun right, ducking under the second guard's grasping arms with a move he'd learned dodging bullies in the school hallway. He felt fingers brush his coat, that old, worn coat with the broken zipper, and then he was past them, sprinting down the corridor toward the nursery door. Leo was fighting for his life and Julian's. But the hardest part hasn't even started yet. If you're not subscribed, you're about to miss the most intense moment of this entire story. Subscribe now. The nursery door was closed. Leo could hear voices on the other side. Urgent, overlapping, medical jargon he didn't understand mixed with the steady electronic wail of machines losing their battle. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle and threw the door open with enough force to send it crashing against the wall. 18 heads turned toward him. 18 faces registered shock, then confusion, then outrage. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear and something else, something sweet and faintly rotten that Leo recognized immediately. The plant. Its poison was in the air itself, had been slowly saturating the nursery for days. What the hell? Security. Security. Who is this kid? Get him out of here. The voices crashed over him like waves, but Leo's eyes were fixed on one thing only. The crib in the center of the room, surrounded by machines and monitors, and men in white coats who'd already started to turn back to their work, dismissing him as a minor disruption to be handled by others. Julian lay in that crib. His tiny chest was barely moving. His skin had gone from blue to gray, like a winter sky right before a storm. The rash had spread across his entire torso now, an angry constellation of raised welts that the doctors had biopsied and tested and analyzed without understanding. He was dying. Minutes now, maybe less. Arthur Kensington stepped forward, his face a mask of grief and rage and desperate confusion. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "Guards, get this. This boy out of my son's room immediately." The guards were already on Leo. He felt hands grip his shoulders, felt himself being lifted off his feet, felt the world tilting as they started to drag him backward toward the door. "The plant!" Leo screamed, fighting against the grip with everything he had. "It's the plant. The one on the windowsill. It's digitalis. It's poison." The guards didn't stop. Of course they didn't stop. He was just a kid, a poor kid, a black kid in a dirty coat, screaming nonsense in a room full of the greatest medical minds in the world. Why would anyone listen to him? "Please." Leo's voice cracked, broke, reformed into something raw and pleading. "My grandmother. She taught me about plants. That one is devil's trumpet. It's toxic. The oils get on everything they touch, and the baby's been breathing it for days. You have to get it out of here. You have to. Remove him," Arthur Kensington said coldly. "Now." This is the moment that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. What Leo does next will haunt you. Subscribe now, you need to see this through. Something inside Leo snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band stretched too far, like a bone pushed past its limit. He'd spent his entire life being invisible, being quiet, being good. He'd swallowed his voice 1,000 times, bitten back his opinions, made himself small so that the wealthy and the powerful wouldn't be troubled by his existence. And where had it gotten him? Here, being dragged out of a room by guards while a baby died because no one would listen to the maid's son. Leo went limp in the guard's arms, a trick he'd learned from watching nature documentaries, how prey animals sometimes played dead to confuse predators. The guard's grip loosened just slightly, their bodies adjusting to what they thought was surrender. Then Leo twisted. He dropped his weight suddenly, slipping downward through their grasp like water through fingers. His elbow caught one guard in the stomach, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to surprise. He scrambled forward on hands and knees, moving faster than they could react, weaving between the legs of startled doctors. Someone grabbed his ankle. He kicked free. Someone else blocked his path. He rolled sideways. The room had erupted into chaos, doctors shouting, guards cursing, equipment crashing as people stumbled into machines. But Leo had eyes only for the crib, for the tiny gray figure lying still as death inside it. He reached the crib. His hands closed around Julian's small body, so light, so terribly light, like holding a bundle of dry leaves, and he lifted the baby against his chest. Julian's head lolled against Leo's shoulder. His breathing was so shallow Leo could barely feel it. Put him down. Arthur Kensington's voice had gone beyond rage into something primal, something animal. Put my son down right now, or I swear to God. But Leo was already moving. Not toward the door, the guards had that blocked. Toward the bathroom. The attached bathroom that he knew existed because he'd seen the blueprints once, left carelessly on the kitchen counter by an architect making renovations. He made it through the door and slammed it behind him, fumbling with the lock as bodies crashed against the wood. The door shuddered, but held. It wouldn't hold for long. These weren't interior doors designed for privacy. They were designer doors designed to look pretty, and the guards would break through in seconds. Leo looked around the bathroom wildly. Marble counters, gold fixtures, a cabinet full of designer baby products that cost more than his textbooks. And there, on the counter, a small jar of activated charcoal powder. The kind wealthy parents bought for natural baby care, for face masks and teeth whitening and detox treatments they read about in magazines. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Charcoal pulls poison from the body, baby. The old folks used to burn wood and grind it up for exactly this. It binds to the toxins, carries them out. The door shuttered again. Wood splintered. Leo moved on instinct now, operating on knowledge that lived in his bones rather than his brain. He grabbed the charcoal powder with one hand while cradling Julian with the other. He turned on the faucet, cold water, because he didn't have time to wait for warm, and wet his fingers. Julian's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, but alive. Still alive. I'm sorry, Leo whispered. I'm so sorry. This is going to feel weird, but I promise I'm trying to help you. I promise. He mixed the charcoal with water in his palm, creating a thin black paste. He tilted Julian's head back gently, carefully, the way he'd seen his grandmother do with sick children in Kingston when she'd administered her remedies. The door exploded inward. This is it. The moment of truth. Everything Leo has risked, his home, his mother's job, his freedom, comes down to the next few seconds. If you're not subscribed, you're going to miss the resolution of this incredible story. Subscribe now. Leo got the charcoal mixture into Julian's mouth just as the guards reached him. Hands grabbed him from every direction. Rough, angry hands that didn't care about being gentle. He felt his arm twist painfully behind his back. Felt his knees hit the marble floor. Felt the baby being torn from his grasp. No, Leo screamed. Don't wipe his mouth. Don't make him throw up. The charcoal needs time to work. Please, please, just give it 5 minutes. But no one was listening. Arthur Kensington was cradling his son now, his face twisted with fury and terror. The doctors were swarming, checking Julian's vitals, examining the black residue around his tiny mouth. Eleanor Kensington had collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. What did you give him? Dr. Sterling demanded, grabbing Leo by the collar. What did you put in that baby's mouth? Activated charcoal, Leo gasped. The guard's knee was on his back now, pressing him into the cold marble floor. Just charcoal. It's not dangerous. It absorbs toxins. My grandmother used to. Your grandmother? Dr. Sterling's voice dripped with contempt. You assaulted a critically ill infant based on your grandmother's advice. The plant, Leo said desperately. Please, just test the plant. The one on the nursery windowsill. It's a digitalis variant. The oils are cardiac glycosides. They've been poisoning him for days through skin contact and inhalation. The charcoal will help bind what's already in his system, but you have to get that plant out of here or he'll keep getting worse. Please, I'm begging you, just test the plant. No one moved. And then, his colors changing. It was Dr. Tanaka. She was standing closest to Arthur Kensington, closest to Julian, and her voice carried that particular quality of scientific observation that cut through the chaos like a knife. What? Arthur Kensington looked down at his son. His color, Dr. Tanaka repeated slowly. He's pinking up. His oxygen levels are rising. Silence fell over the bathroom like a held breath. Leo couldn't see Julian from his position on the floor, but he could see the faces of the doctors. He watched shock replace skepticism, watched confusion replace contempt, watched 18 world-renowned physicians realize that something impossible was happening. That's not possible, Dr. Sterling said flatly. Activated charcoal can't work that fast. There's no mechanism by which. His heart rhythm is stabilizing. Dr. Tanaka had pulled out a portable monitor, was pressing it to Julian's tiny chest. Sinus rhythm normalizing. Blood pressure coming up. The rash, Eleanor Kensington whispered. Oh my God, look at the rash. Leo couldn't see, but he heard the gasps that told him everything. The angry welts were fading. The poison that had been strangling Julian's system was being bound, neutralized, pulled away by the simple black powder that Leo's grandmother had kept in her kitchen cabinet next to the flour and the sugar. Get off him, Arthur Kensington said quietly. The guard's knee pressed harder into Leo's back. Sir, I said get off him. Arthur Kensington's voice was different now. The rage was gone, replaced by something Leo couldn't identify. Get off that boy right now. The pressure on Leo's spine released. He stayed where he was for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Then slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up to his knees. Arthur Kensington was staring at him. Julian was staring at him too. The baby's eyes clear now, focused, tracking Leo's face with something that might have been recognition. The plant, Leo said one more time, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, just test the plant. Dr. Sterling walked out of the bathroom. 2 minutes later, Leo heard him shout from the nursery. Get a contamination team in here now. Everyone who touched that plant needs to scrub their hands. And someone call the poison center. I need everything they have on digitalis lonatotoxicity. Leo closed his eyes. It was over. One way or another, it was over. Julian was going to live. And Leo had no idea what was going to happen to him next. Leo saved the baby. But now comes the aftermath, and the questions that could destroy everything. Who sent that plant? And what will Arthur Kensington do with the boy who broke into his home, assaulted his staff, and forced medicine down his infant son's throat? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single word. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and hushed voices. Leo sat in a chair outside the nursery, not the servants' quarters, not the security office, not a police interrogation room. A chair, right there in the hallway, where anyone walking past could see him, where Arthur Kensington had personally told him to wait. No one had put him in handcuffs. No one had called the police. No one had dragged him off the property or threatened to press charges or done any of the things Leo had been certain would happen the moment he'd crashed through that service entrance door. Instead, they'd brought him water, a sandwich, a blanket when one of the nurses noticed he was shivering. He didn't understand any of it. Through the nursery doorway, he could see Julian sleeping peacefully in his crib. The baby's color had returned to normal, warm brown skin instead of that terrible deathly gray. His monitors beeped steadily now, tracking vital signs that climbed stronger with every passing hour. The army of doctors had thinned to just 3, running final tests, conferring in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the hallway where Leo sat wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe. Dr. Tanaka had been the first to apologize. She'd come out of the nursery around midnight, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. She'd stood in front of Leo's chair, looked at him for a long moment, and then bowed her head. "I was wrong," she said simply. "We were all wrong. You saw what we couldn't see, and you saved that child's life. I'm sorry we didn't listen." Leo hadn't known what to say. He'd mumbled something. "Thank you, maybe, or it's okay," and Dr. Tanaka had nodded once and walked away. This story started with a boy in the shadows. Now the whole world is about to see him. If you've made it this far, you need to see it through to the end. Subscribe now. The best part is still coming. The investigation began before dawn. Arthur Kensington had called in a private security firm, not the guards who patrolled his estate, but a team of former FBI agents and forensic specialists who arrived in unmarked vehicles and set up a command center in the mansion's east wing. Leo watched them work through the windows, unpacking equipment, photographing the nursery, carefully removing the plant in a sealed container. Around 6 a.m., a detective approached Leo's chair. "Mr. Kensington wants to speak with you," she said. Her voice was neutral, professional. "Are you up for that?" Leo's stomach tightened. This was it. The moment when the gratitude would end and the reality would begin. The moment when Arthur Kensington would remember that Leo was still a trespasser, still a nobody, still the maid's son who'd broken into his home and put his hands on his infant child without permission. "Yes, ma'am," Leo said, because what else could he say? She led him down the corridor, past the family portraits and the antique vases he'd sprinted past hours earlier, past the servants' staircase where he'd dodged the guards, past 100 small reminders of the invisible barriers he'd spent his whole life never crossing. Arthur Kensington was waiting in his study. Leo had never been inside this room. He'd glimpsed it through doorways, seen the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the massive mahogany desk and the windows that overlooked the gardens where Leo's mother sometimes worked. But standing here now, surrounded by more wealth than his entire extended family would earn in 10 lifetimes, he felt smaller than he'd ever felt before. "Sit down, Leo." It was the first time Arthur Kensington had ever said his name. Leo sat. Arthur Kensington looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single night. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like the shattering of everything he'd believed about his own power. He was holding a folder in his hands, thick with papers, and his fingers were trembling slightly as he turned the pages. "The plant," Arthur began slowly, "was a gift. It arrived 3 days ago with a card congratulating my wife and me on Julian's 3-month birthday. The card was signed by Marcus Webb." Leo didn't recognize the name, but he saw the way Arthur's jaw tightened when he said it. "Marcus Webb was my business partner. We built Kensington Webb Technologies together 23 years ago, working out of a garage in Palo Alto. He was the best man at my wedding. Julian's godfather." Arthur's voice cracked on the last word. "I trusted him with everything. My company, my family, my son. The truth behind the poison gift is more devastating than anyone imagined. But there's more to come, so much more. Subscribe now to see justice served." The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. The forensic team had found traces of the plant's toxic oils on the gardener's gloves, the same gloves that had been used to adjust Julian's crib railing. They'd found residue on the nursery windowsill, on the curtains, on the mobile that hung above the baby's bed. The plant had been shedding its poison steadily for 3 days, saturating the room with invisible death. But that wasn't all they'd found. The delivery company that had brought the plant kept meticulous records. Security cameras, GPS tracking, digital signatures. Within hours, the investigators had traced the package back to its source, not a legitimate nursery or greenhouse, but a private laboratory that specialized in rare botanical specimens. The laboratory was owned by a shell company. The shell company was funded by accounts in the Cayman Islands. The accounts had been opened by Marcus Webb. "He wanted my son dead," Arthur said, and his voice was barely human anymore. It was the sound of something breaking apart from the inside. "He wanted to destroy me, and he chose the most precious thing in my life to do it. Because I beat him. Because the board chose me over him. Because I got the CEO position and he got pushed out with nothing but stock options and a pat on the back." Leo sat very still. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he was supposed to say anything. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Arthur continued. "The doctors would never have figured it out. Never. They were so focused on their blood tests and their imaging scans and their genetic analyses, so certain that the answer had to be something complex, something that matched their training, that they never once looked around the room. Never once asked what had changed in Julian's environment. Never once considered that the simplest explanation might be the right one. He looked at Leo with something that might have been wonder. But you did. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My grandmother taught me about plants. She said that rich doctors always look for rich problems. Sometimes the answer is just sitting there, in front of everyone. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Leo's throat tightened. She died when I was 11. She was going to teach me more, but she ran out of time. Arthur nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder in his hands, at the evidence of betrayal by someone he'd loved like a brother. Then he pressed a button on his desk phone. Send them in, he said. Everything Leo thought he knew about his life is about to change. This is the moment, the one you've been waiting for. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single word of what happens next. The door opened, and Leo's mother walked in. Grace looked like she'd been crying for hours. Her uniform was disheveled, her hair escaping from its usually perfect bun, her eyes swollen and red. Behind her came Eleanor Kensington, still in the clothes she'd been wearing during the crisis, holding Julian against her chest like she would never let him go again. Leo, Grace rushed to her son, pulling him into an embrace so tight he could barely breathe. Leo, baby, I was so scared. They told me what you did. They told me you broke in and the guards chased you and you. Mama, I'm okay. Leo hugged her back, breathing in the familiar scent of laundry soap and the industrial cleaner she used on the Kensington floors. I'm okay. Julian's okay. Everything's okay. You could have been arrested. Grace pulled back to look at him, her hands gripping his shoulders. You could have been hurt. You could have. He could have saved himself the trouble and done nothing. Arthur Kensington interrupted quietly. He could have stayed in your cottage and let my son die while 18 doctors fumbled in the dark. But he didn't. Grace turned to look at the billionaire, and Leo saw fear flash across her face. The deep, instinctive fear of someone who'd spent their whole life at the mercy of powerful people. But Arthur didn't look angry. He looked humbled. Mrs. Carter, he said, using his mother's last name with a respect Leo had never heard from anyone on this estate. Your son is the only reason my son is alive right now. The doctors failed. The security failed. I failed. But Leo, Arthur's voice broke. He stopped, composed himself, started again. Leo ran into a building full of people who saw him as a threat. He fought through guards who could have seriously hurt him. He grabbed a critically ill baby and administered a treatment that went against everything the medical experts were saying. He did all of that knowing that if he was wrong, it would ruin both your lives. He wasn't wrong, Eleanor Kensington said softly. She stepped forward, Julian sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. He was right. He was the only one who was right. She looked at Leo, and there were tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my baby. Leo didn't know what to do with the gratitude of rich people. He'd spent his whole life avoiding their notice, and now here they were, looking at him like he was something precious instead of something to be managed. I couldn't let him die, Leo said awkwardly. Not when I knew what was wrong. Not when I could do something about it. That's exactly the point, Arthur said. He stood up from his desk, walked around it, and did something Leo never expected in a million years. He knelt down in front of Leo's chair. A billionaire. On his knees, looking up at the maid's son. I've spent my entire life believing that money and education and connections were the only things that mattered, Arthur said. I built walls around this estate to keep out the people I thought were beneath me. I hired guards to protect my family from threats I imagined in the shadows. And the whole time, the real threat walked right through my front door in a pretty pot with a gold bow, and the only person who could see it was the boy I'd taught my staff to ignore. He reached out and took Leo's hand. I was wrong. About so many things. And I don't know how to make that right. But I'm going to try. The boy in the shadows is about to step into the light, permanently. But his story isn't over yet. Subscribe now to see how Leo's act of courage changes everything, forever. Marcus Webb was arrested the next morning. Leo watched it happen from the nursery window, watched the police cars roll up the driveway, watched the man who tried to murder a baby get led away in handcuffs while camera flashes exploded around him. The story had leaked somehow, and news vans were lined up along the estate's perimeter, reporters shouting questions that no one answered. But the arrest was only the beginning. Arthur Kensington didn't just want justice. He wanted demolition. Within a week, he'd mobilized an army of lawyers to dismantle everything Marcus Webb had built. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the stock options and board positions, and country club memberships. Every piece of the empire that Webb had constructed on a foundation of resentment and rage. He'll die in prison, Arthur told Leo during one of their now daily conversations. The billionaire had taken to seeking Leo out, asking him questions about plants and healing, and the grandmother who'd taught him things that medical schools didn't know. The charges are attempted murder of an infant. Even white-collar criminals don't survive that. Leo nodded. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in Arthur's presence, still felt the weight of the class divide that had defined his entire life. But something had shifted between them. Something real. What happens now? Leo asked. To the estate, I mean. To everything. Arthur smiled. A tired smile, but a real one. Now, he said, we tear down the walls. He meant it literally. Over the following weeks, Leo watched as construction crews dismantled the fences that had surrounded the Kensington property. The guard towers came down. The staff-only signs disappeared. The servants' entrance was sealed, and a new main entrance was built, one that everyone used, regardless of their position. But Arthur wasn't done. There's going to be a medical center, he announced at a press conference that Leo watched from the crowd, standing between his mother and Eleanor Kensington. A free clinic, open to everyone in the community, focused on accessible care and traditional medicine. It's going to be staffed by doctors who know how to listen, who know how to look at the whole picture instead of just the test results. He paused, and his eyes found Leo's in the crowd. It's going to be called the Miriam Carter Wellness Center, named after the woman who taught her grandson the knowledge that saved my son's life. Leo's vision blurred. His grandmother's name. On a building. A real building where real people would receive real help because of something she'd taught him on a porch in Kingston 12 years ago. Grace was crying beside him. Not the scared tears he'd seen so many times before. Tears of worry about rent and job security and whether they'd make it through another month. These were different. These were the tears of someone who'd just realized that their sacrifices had been worth something. There's one more thing, Arthur said into the microphones. My family owes a debt we can never fully repay. So we're starting with what we can do. He announced the scholarship fund. Full tuition to any university in the world, for Leo and any future children Grace might have. He announced the house, not the groundskeeper's cottage, but a real house on the property, with Leo's name on the deed alongside his mother's. He announced a position for Grace on the board of the new medical center, with a salary that made her gasp when she heard the number. But for Leo, the most important announcement was smaller, quieter. Something Arthur said to him privately, after the cameras had left and the reporters had filed their stories. I'm setting up an apprenticeship, Arthur said, with the best botanical researchers in the world, if you want it. So you can learn everything your grandmother didn't get the chance to teach you. So you can become the kind of healer she was raising you to be. Leo thought about his grandmother, about the promise he'd made to her, to use her wisdom when it mattered, about all the years he'd spent being ashamed of his inheritance, wishing he could be something more respectable. He'd been wrong about that. So wrong. His grandmother's knowledge wasn't something to overcome. It was something to build on. A foundation of wisdom that stretched back generations, waiting for him to add his own layer to the structure. Yes, Leo said. I want that. More than anything. Arthur nodded. And then he did something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He pulled Leo into a hug, holding him the way Leo imagined fathers held their sons. Thank you, Arthur whispered, for being brave when it mattered, for being the person I should have seen all along. Leo hugged him back. He wasn't invisible anymore. The poison gift has been exposed. The villain has been caught. But Leo's transformation isn't complete yet. Chapter 5 reveals the new legacy, the one that Leo will build on the foundation his grandmother left him. Subscribe now to see how this incredible story ends. 1 year later, Leo stood in front of a building that bore his grandmother's name. The Miriam Carter Wellness Center gleamed in the afternoon sun, its glass walls reflecting the gardens that surrounded it. Gardens that Leo himself had helped design, filling them with the medicinal plants his grandmother had taught him to recognize. lavender for anxiety, chamomile for sleep, echinacea for immunity, and in one carefully controlled greenhouse, a collection of toxic specimens behind locked doors, used to train the next generation of doctors to see what 18 experts had once missed. Today was the grand opening. Leo tugged at the collar of his new suit, a gift from Eleanor Kensington, tailored to fit him perfectly, made from fabric softer than anything he'd ever worn. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in clothes like these. Part of him probably never would be. But he was learning that discomfort wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it meant you were growing into a new version of yourself. You ready? His mother appeared beside him, and Leo's breath caught the way it always did when he saw her now. Grace Carter had transformed over the past year. Not just her clothes, though those had changed too. The worn uniforms replaced by professional attire that matched her new position, but something deeper. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. She stood straighter now, spoke louder, took up space in a way she never had when she was just the maid. She was the director of community outreach for the wellness center. She had an office with her name on the door. She had business cards and a staff and a voice in decisions that affected thousands of people. I don't know, Leo admitted. There's a lot of people out there. Grace smiled and squeezed his hand. There's a lot of people out there because of you, baby. They came to see the boy who saved a billionaire's son with kitchen charcoal and his grandmother's wisdom. I had help. You had knowledge. You had courage. You had everything your grandmother gave you. Grace's eyes glistened. She'd be so proud of you, Leo. So proud. This journey started with a boy who believed his poverty made him nothing. Look at him now. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. The world needs more Leos. The crowd outside was larger than Leo had expected. Hundreds of people filled the gardens, spilling onto the lawns that had once been strictly off-limits to anyone without a Kensington invitation. There were families from the surrounding neighborhoods, the communities that had always existed in the shadow of the estate, separated by fences and guard dogs and the invisible walls of class. There were medical professionals who'd traveled from around the world to see this new model of healthcare that combined traditional wisdom with modern medicine. There were journalists and photographers and camera crews capturing every moment. And there, in the front row, sat Arthur and Eleanor Kensington with Julian on Eleanor's lap. The baby was thriving now, 14 months old, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes and a laugh that rang out across the garden whenever something delighted him. He'd hit every developmental milestone right on schedule, showing no lasting effects from the poisoning that had nearly killed him. The doctors said it was a miracle. Leo knew it wasn't a miracle. It was activated charcoal and quick thinking and a grandmother who'd understood that healing was about paying attention to the whole picture, not just the parts you could measure with machines. Arthur stood as Leo approached the podium, leading the crowd in applause that washed over Leo like warm water. A year ago, this man had been a distant figure glimpsed through windows, powerful, untouchable, belonging to a world Leo could never enter. Now he was something else. Not quite a father, not quite a friend, but something in between. A mentor, maybe. A believer. Thank you all for coming, Arthur said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the gardens. 1 year ago, I almost lost my son. I had every resource in the world. Money, connections, the best medical experts on the planet, and none of it was enough. I was helpless. Hopeless. Watching my child die, while the people I'd paid millions of dollars couldn't tell me why. He paused, and Leo saw him glance toward the cottage where Leo and his mother had lived for so many years. The cottage was still there, but it had been renovated now, expanded, modernized, turned into a guest house for visiting researchers. The Carters had moved into a real home on the property, with bedrooms for each of them and a garden where Grace grew vegetables and a front door that faced the main drive instead of the service entrance. And then a 14-year-old boy broke into my house, Arthur continued, fought past my security guards, and saved my son's life with knowledge that no medical school teaches. Knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge I had been taught to dismiss as superstition, as folklore, as the uneducated beliefs of people who didn't know any better. His voice cracked slightly. I was the one who didn't know any better. I was the one who'd built walls so high I couldn't see the wisdom standing right outside them. Leo Carter taught me that expertise comes in many forms. and that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see most clearly. Arthur Kensington built an empire, but it took a poor black boy to show him what really matters. If you believe that everyone's voice deserves to be heard, subscribe now and share this story. Let's make sure it reaches everyone who needs it. Leo took the podium with trembling hands. He'd written a speech, practiced it dozens of times in front of his mirror, in front of his mother, in front of Julian's crib while the baby giggled at his nervous pacing. But standing here now, looking out at the sea of faces waiting to hear what he had to say, the words on his note cards felt wrong. Too polished, too perfect, too much like someone he wasn't. So he set the cards aside and spoke from his heart. My grandmother's name was Miriam Carter, Leo began. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, in a house with no running water and a dirt floor. She never learned to read. She never went to school past the 4th grade. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters, she was nobody. He looked at the building behind him, at her name etched in stone above the entrance. But she saved more lives than most doctors ever will. She delivered babies for mothers who couldn't afford hospitals. She treated fevers with herbs when there was no money for medicine. She sat with dying people and held their hands and gave them dignity when they had nothing else. She knew things about plants, about the body, about healing, that she learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from generations of people who had to figure out how to survive when no one else would help them. Leo's voice steadied as he spoke. The nervousness was fading, replaced by something stronger. Pride, maybe, or purpose. She used to tell me that our knowledge was our inheritance. Not money, not land, not fancy degrees. Just what she put in my head and what I would put in my children's heads someday. She said that knowledge was worth more than gold because no one could ever take it away from you. He thought about the night he'd broken into the mansion, the terror and the certainty and the desperate prayer that he wasn't wrong. For a long time, I was ashamed of that inheritance. I wanted to be modern, sophisticated. I wanted to fit in with a world that looked down on people like my grandmother, that called her knowledge superstition and her wisdom ignorance. I thought that if I could just be smart enough, educated enough, impressive enough, I could escape where I came from. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. Where I come from isn't something to escape. It's something to build on. The knowledge my grandmother gave me saved a baby's life when 18 doctors with degrees from the best universities in the world couldn't figure out what was wrong. That's not despite my background. It's because of it. Because my grandmother taught me to look at the whole picture, to pay attention to the environment, not just the symptoms, to trust what I could see with my own eyes, even when experts were telling me I was wrong. Leo's grandmother never got to see this moment, but her legacy will live forever. If you believe that wisdom comes from more places than textbooks, subscribe and share this story. Help us spread the message that everyone has something valuable to offer. Leo looked out at the crowd and saw faces that mirrored his own journey. There were kids from the neighborhood, black and brown kids in secondhand clothes, kids who walked to school past mansions they'd never enter, kids who'd been taught by 1,000 small moments that they were less than, not enough, invisible. They were looking at him now with something in their eyes that made his chest tight. Hope, maybe, or recognition. He spoke directly to them. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to walk through the world like you're made of glass, like the people with money and power could look right through you without ever seeing who you really are. I know what it's like to believe that your poverty makes you nothing, that your circumstances define your worth, that the only way to matter is to become someone completely different from who you were born to be. Leo's voice grew stronger. But I'm standing here today to tell you that's a lie. The things that make you different, your background, your culture, your family's knowledge, the lessons your grandmothers taught you, those aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're strengths to build on. They're perspectives that the world needs, insights that no amount of money can buy, wisdom that gets passed down through generations of people who figured out how to survive and thrive when everything was stacked against them. He gestured to the wellness center behind him. This building exists because a boy from a groundskeeper's cottage knew something that 18 doctors didn't. It exists because knowledge matters, no matter where it comes from. And it's going to be a place where all knowledge is valued, where the grandmother's remedies sit alongside the surgeon's techniques, where we listen to patients instead of just testing them, where no one is invisible and no one's wisdom is dismissed. Leo took a deep breath. My grandmother used to say that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken in the body. It's about seeing the whole person, their history, their environment, their community, their soul. It's about treating people with dignity, whether they're billionaires or housekeepers. It's about remembering that we're all connected, all part of the same human family, all deserving of care and attention and respect. He looked at Arthur Kensington, at his mother, at baby Julian bouncing happily on Eleanor's lap. That's what this center is going to be about. That's what my grandmother's legacy is going to mean. Not just a building with her name on it, but a new way of thinking about who gets to be an expert, whose knowledge counts, and how we take care of each other. Leo smiled. A real smile, the kind he used to hide behind walls of invisibility. My name is Leo Carter. I'm the maid's son, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that no one like me ever has to feel invisible again. This is Leo's legacy. This is Miriam Carter's legacy. And if you've read this far, it's part of your story now too. Subscribe and share this message with everyone who needs to hear it. Let's build a world where everyone's voice matters. The applause started somewhere in the back and rolled forward like thunder. Leo stood at the podium, overwhelmed, as hundreds of people rose to their feet. He saw tears on faces he didn't recognize, saw children clapping with wild enthusiasm, saw his mother sobbing openly while Arthur Kensington put a steadying hand on her shoulder. And then Julian Kensington did something that silenced the entire crowd. The toddler squirmed out of his mother's arms, dropped to the ground on unsteady legs, and began walking, tottering, really, with that uncertain gait of a child just learning to trust his own feet. Eleanor reached for him, but Arthur held her back, watching with an expression of wonder as his son navigated through the forest of adult legs. Julian walked straight to Leo. He stopped at the edge of the podium, looked up with those bright eyes that had once been clouded with poison, and raised his chubby arms in the universal gesture of children everywhere. Up, pick me up. Leo stepped down from the podium and lifted Julian into his arms. The baby immediately snuggled against his chest, one small hand fisting in Leo's new suit jacket, utterly content. Lily, Julian said clearly. His first real word besides mama and dada. Lily. The crowd lost its mind. Leo held the baby close, feeling Julian's heartbeat against his own, strong and steady and alive. This child who had almost died in his arms was now saying his name, reaching for him, trusting him completely. This was what mattered. Not the fancy building or the scholarship or the house with his name on the deed. This, a life saved, a connection made, a bridge built between two worlds that had never been meant to touch. Leo looked at the wellness center with his grandmother's name on it. He looked at his mother, standing tall and proud for the first time in his memory. He looked at Arthur Kensington, the billionaire who'd learned to kneel. He looked at the crowd full of people who'd come to see a new kind of legacy begin. And he thought about his grandmother, somewhere beyond the veil, watching her grandson stand in the light at last. Thank you, Grandma, he thought. I kept my promise. I used what you taught me when it mattered. And I'm going to keep using it, every day, for the rest of my life. Julian gurgled happily and patted Leo's face with a sticky hand. Leo laughed, a real laugh, free and joyful and completely unguarded. He wasn't the boy in the shadows anymore. He was Leo Carter, healer, teacher, bridge builder, his grandmother's grandson. And his story was just beginning. The end. Thank you for following Leo's incredible journey from the shadows to the light. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about whose voices deserve to be heard, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Remember, you are not invisible. Your background is not a limitation, it's a foundation. And the knowledge you carry, the wisdom your family gave you, the perspective that comes from your unique experience, the world needs all of it. Until next time, stay blessed, stay bold, and never stop believing that one person can change everything. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. And leave a comment telling us, what wisdom did your grandmother teach you that the world needs to hear?